My name is Sophie, and I'm 28 years old. I spent most of my life believing that grief was something families survived together. That when the worst happened, the people who shared your blood would close ranks around you, hold you up, and remind you that you were not alone. I believed that right up until the morning my grandmother was buried, when my brother looked me in the eye over her casket and said, "Let me handle everything. You're too emotional to be making financial decisions right now." I didn't argue. I was too emotional. My grandmother, Dorothy, had been the axis around which my entire world quietly rotated. She was 79 years old and sharper than anyone I'd ever met. She taught herself bookkeeping at 62, grew tomatoes on her back porch that won the county fair 3 years running, and kept a small wooden box on her nightstand filled with index cards she called her philosophy collection. Quotes she'd cut out from magazines, things neighbors had said that made her think, lines from books she wanted to carry with her. She gave me one on my 16th birthday. It said, "The most radical thing a woman can do is trust herself." I still have it taped to the inside of my kitchen cabinet door. She raised me, essentially. Not in the legal sense, but in the way that actually counts. My parents divorced when I was 6, and the years that followed were a blur of passed-off weekends and distracted phone calls. My brother, who is 9 years older than me and built an entire identity around being the responsible firstborn, handled things the way he always had by inserting himself into every situation, taking control, and making sure everyone knew it. He was 37 years old, worked in commercial real estate, and had the kind of confidence that people sometimes mistake for competence. So when he said, at the graveside, that he would handle everything, I let him. My grandmother's estate wasn't complicated, or so I thought. There was the house in Millbrook, a white Cape Cod with green shutters that smelled like lavender and old books, and there was her savings account, somewhere around $90,000 that she'd built over decades of careful living. In her handwritten will, she left the house and everything in it equally to both of us. Split down the middle, my brother would manage the sale if we chose to sell, and the proceeds would be divided equally. What I didn't know then was that he had already decided to do something different. The accident happened 11 days after the funeral. I was driving back from visiting her house one last time before it went on the market, or so I'd been told, and a driver ran a red light on Route 9 and hit my passenger side at 40 miles an hour. I walked away with a fractured wrist, 2 broken ribs, and a deep laceration on my left leg that required 32 stitches. I was conscious and coherent through all of it. I signed my own paperwork at the hospital. I called my own insurance company from the emergency room. I was in pain, but I was present. My brother texted me while the doctor was still stitching my leg. "Heard about the accident. Are you okay? Don't worry about the estate stuff, I've got it covered. Focus on healing." I read the message and felt something that I now recognize as relief, which is embarrassing to admit. Even then, I thought he was being generous. I thought "I've got it covered" meant he was taking a burden off my plate while I recovered. I thought it was the first genuinely kind thing he had done since our grandmother died. I was wrong about what those words meant. My neighbor, a woman named Ruth who had lived across the hall from me for 4 years, drove me home from the hospital. She was 67, a retired high school English teacher who had a habit of bringing me soup when I had a cold and leaving paperback novels outside my door with sticky notes that said things like, "This one will wreck you in the best way." She helped me into my apartment, set me up on the couch with a pillow under my leg, and didn't say a word about how the place looked or how pale I was or any of the things that people say when they want you to know they've noticed how bad things are. She just put a glass of water on the coffee table, set her phone face up next to it and said, "I'll be right across the hall. You knock on that wall if you need anything at all." Then she sat down in the chair across from me and stayed for 3 hours. She didn't hover. She read her book. But she was there. It was the most comforting thing anyone had done for me in weeks, and I fell asleep on the couch to the sound of her quietly turning pages. The days that followed had a strange, cottony quality. Pain medication, physical therapy appointments, the slow business of healing. My brother called twice. Both calls lasted under 4 minutes. The first time, he asked how the pain was. The second time, he told me he'd found a buyer for the house. I said that was fast. He said the market was good and it was better not to wait. I said okay. I said keep me posted. He said he would. He didn't. 3 weeks after my accident, I started going through my mail. I'd been ignoring it out of a combination of physical exhaustion and the particular emotional numbness that had settled over me like a second skin since my grandmother died. Ruth had been collecting it in a neat stack on my kitchen counter and hadn't said a word about it, which was exactly right of her. I wasn't ready until I was ready. I sat at the kitchen table one afternoon with a mug of tea and started opening envelopes. Most of it was unremarkable. A medical bill. An insurance explanation of benefits. A credit card statement. And then, near the bottom of the pile, an envelope from a law firm I didn't recognize, addressed to me by name. I opened it slowly. It was a letter from an estate attorney I had never heard of, referencing my grandmother's estate and a document called a petition for sole executorship, which had been filed with the probate court in our county. The letter was a notification that the petition had been approved. My brother had petitioned to have himself named the sole executor of my grandmother's estate. Not joint executor. Sole. And the petition had been granted 3 days after my accident, while I was still at home with broken ribs and a leg I could barely stand on. I read the letter 3 times. Then I put it down on the table and stared at the wall for a long time. There was a particular kind of cold that settled into my chest. Not the cold of shock exactly, but the cold of a door swinging open onto something you already half knew was there. I thought about all the times growing up that my brother had managed to position himself at the center of every decision, every resource, every conversation about money. The way he'd been named on my grandmother's bank accounts years ago because she needed help managing her finances when her eyesight started going, and he had volunteered before I was even consulted. The way he'd offered to handle everything at the graveside before I had even thought to ask. The way he'd said I've got it covered while I was sitting in an emergency room with blood on my jeans. He hadn't been taking a burden off my plate. He had been removing me from the table entirely. I picked up the phone and called him. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice easy and professional in the way that it always was when he knew a conversation was coming that he'd already prepared for. Hey, how are you feeling? Is the wrist? Why did you file a petition to become the sole executor without telling me? There was a pause. Not a long one, but long enough. Sophie. His tone shifted into something I recognized from childhood, the measured, slightly tired voice he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. It's just a legal formality. It makes the sale process cleaner. Joint executorship creates delays. I'm protecting both our interests here. Without telling me. I didn't want to bother you while you were recovering. I held the phone and looked at the letter. The house. Has the sale gone through? Another pause. We're in escrow. And the proceeds are being managed appropriately. Managed appropriately. Something about the phrase made my stomach turn. He had spent 20 years around real estate transactions. He knew exactly how to make financial maneuvering sound like responsibility. I want to see every document, I said. Every filing, every account statement, everything related to this estate. I want it by the end of the week. Sophie, you're still recovering. You don't need to. End of the week, I said, and I hung up. I sat at the table for a long time after that. The tea went cold. Outside my window, the afternoon light was doing the thing it does in October, going golden and sideways, and under any other circumstances I would have found it beautiful. Instead, I was sitting with the particular loneliness of realizing that someone you trusted had been planning around you the whole time. I didn't cry. I was too angry to cry. But I noticed something underneath the anger that I recognized from years of being the younger one, the less serious one, the one who went into graphic design instead of finance, a quiet, ingrained instinct to wonder whether I was overreacting. Whether he was right that it was a formality. Whether I was making this harder than it needed to be. I had read something once about how people who grow up in families where their needs are consistently treated as inconveniences learn to preemptively dismiss those needs themselves. It becomes automatic. You start doing their work for them, telling yourself you're fine, talking yourself out of the very clarity that's trying to protect you. It's not weakness. It's what happens when you spend enough years being told your feelings are the problem. I had spent a lot of years being told that. I knocked on Ruth's door. She opened it immediately, like she'd been nearby, which I suspect she had. She looked at my face and didn't ask any questions. She just stepped aside and let me in. I sat at her kitchen table. She was a woman who did her living at her kitchen table, which I had always loved about her, and I told her everything. The petition, the escrow, the letter, the phone call. She listened without interrupting, which is a skill most people do not have and which I have never stopped being grateful for in her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How much of the estate are we talking about?" The house was listed at $340,000. Plus the savings. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes did. Sophie, that's not a family misunderstanding. That's theft with paperwork. She got up from the table and went to the small desk in the corner of her living room. She opened the second drawer and took out a business card, which she brought back and placed in front of me. It was worn at the edges. The name on it was a woman named Patricia Huang, estate and probate attorney. I've known Patricia for 15 years, Ruth said. She handled my late husband's estate. She is very good, and she is not the kind of person who gets pushed around. She paused. Neither are you, for the record. But right now you need someone who knows how this specific game is played. I looked at the card for a long moment. I don't know how much she costs. Call her first, Ruth said. Worry about that second. I called Patricia Huang the next morning. She answered her own phone, which surprised me. I told her who I was and how I'd gotten her number, and then I told her the situation, reading directly from the letter as I went. I expected her to tell me to come in for a consultation, to give me a timeline, to be cautious and preliminary the way professionals usually are. Instead, after a moment, she said, "Your brother filed that petition while you were incapacitated following an accident? Yes. Were you notified of the filing before it was approved? No. Do you have a copy of your grandmother's original will? I did. She had given me one herself 2 years ago, pressed between the pages of a cookbook she left on my doorstep with a note that said, "In case I forget to tell you, I think you're going to be fine." Patricia asked me to come in the following afternoon. I sat across from her in her office, which was small and organized in the way that belongs to people who actually use their space, and she went through everything I'd brought with a focused, methodical efficiency that was deeply reassuring. The original will, the notification letter, the text messages from my brother. She explained that a sole executorship petition filed without notifying a named co-beneficiary was, at minimum, procedurally questionable and potentially grounds for challenge, particularly given the timing. She explained that as a co-beneficiary, I had legal standing to request a full accounting of the estate, every transaction, every disbursement, every fee. She explained that if my brother had used his position as executor to act in his own financial interest at my expense, that constituted a breach of fiduciary duty. Then, she said something I hadn't expected. "I'd like to request that accounting now, before the sale closes. If we move today, we can file a motion to pause the escrow pending full disclosure." I looked at her. "That's possible? If the court agrees, there's cause to question the executor's conduct." She looked at the documents in front of her. "I think there's cause." I gave her authorization to proceed. What she found, over the next 10 days, was worse than I had imagined and exactly as bad as I had feared, which is its own particular kind of terrible. My brother had, in the 6 weeks since my grandmother's death, paid himself an executor's fee of $14,000 from the estate. A fee that was not specified in the will and was significantly above what is typical for an estate of this size. He had also paid 2 invoices from a property management company to prepare the house for sale, invoices which, when Patricia's investigator looked into it, turned out to be a company registered to his wife. The invoices totaled $22,000 for services that neighbors said they never saw performed. He had, in short, been billing his own pockets from our grandmother's estate from the moment the ground closed over her. Patricia filed the motion. The escrow was paused. The court appointed a neutral administrator to oversee the estate pending a full accounting. And I called my brother. He picked up on the first ring, which told me he'd been expecting this call. There was no breezy professionalism this time. His voice was tight in the way I remembered from when we were children, and he'd been caught in something. "You got an attorney involved," he said. "Not a question." "Yes." "Sophie, this is going to make everything more complicated. The buyer may walk. You're going to cost both of us. You billed $22,000 to a company your wife owns," I said. "For work that wasn't done." Silence. "And you took a $14,000 executor's fee without disclosing it." More silence. "I'm not calling to argue," I said. "I'm calling because Patricia is going to send you a formal accounting request, and I want you to know that I know, and that I am not going to pretend I don't know, and that whatever you tell yourself about this being complicated or me being emotional, I know what you did. You don't understand the pressure." "I don't need to," I said. My voice was very level. I was surprised by how level it was. "I don't need to understand your pressures. What you had was access to something that wasn't entirely yours, and you used it like it was. That's what happened." He started to say something else. I don't remember what it was. I told him to talk to his own attorney, and I hung up. I sat in my apartment in the silence that followed and waited to feel something dramatic. Rage, maybe. Or grief. What I actually felt was closer to clarity. Like a room after you open all the windows at once. There's something nobody tells you about confronting someone who has wronged you, which is that it doesn't feel the way you expect. It doesn't feel like winning, exactly. There's too much loss woven through it for that. I wasn't thinking about what I was getting back. I was thinking about the index cards in my grandmother's nightstand box, and whether anyone had thought to save them. I was thinking about the last time I sat in her kitchen and she poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs and said, "You know, Sophie, the ones who doubt themselves the most are usually the ones who see the most clearly." I was thinking about how she would have felt knowing what her grandson had done with what she'd spent her whole life carefully building. And then I thought about what she would have said. She would have said, "Handle it." The legal process took 4 more months. The estate accounting revealed a total of approximately $38,000 in improper payments and fees that my brother had taken or directed. The court ordered full restitution to the estate, which meant to both of us as equal beneficiaries. His attorney fees ate significantly into his portion. The house sale eventually closed, at a slightly lower price because the delay had cooled the buyer's enthusiasm, but it closed. I received my share of the estate in January. It was enough to pay off my remaining student loans with a significant remainder. Enough to establish the kind of financial foundation that changes what your future can look like. But that's not actually what I want to tell you about. I want to tell you about what happened in the weeks after the confrontation, while the legal process was still running and I was still healing physically and I was in that uncertain middle space where the outcome wasn't clear yet. Ruth made dinner for me every Tuesday night. Not because I asked, but because she started doing it one week when I was low and then kept doing it because that's what Ruth does. Her kitchen smelled like rosemary and the particular comfort of someone who has been cooking in the same space for decades. We ate at her kitchen table and she told me about her students from 30 years of teaching, and I showed her my design work on my laptop, and some evenings we just sat and read in companionable quiet. One Tuesday in November she looked up from her book and said, out of nowhere, "You know what I've noticed about you these last few months?" I shook my head. "You apologize before you ask for anything. Even when what you're asking for is completely reasonable." She paused. "You've been doing it your whole life, I'd guess." I thought about that for a long time after I went home. She was right. I had been apologizing for taking up space since I was old enough to understand that my presence was sometimes treated as an inconvenience. I had learned to make myself small, to second-guess my own observations, to assume that when someone in authority told me I was being too emotional, the problem was the emotion rather than whatever had provoked it. It is a strange thing to recognize a pattern in yourself that you have been living inside of without ever quite seeing its edges. Not because you're oblivious, but because it became the water you swam in so long ago that you stopped noticing it was water. I wasn't weak for having trusted my brother. I wasn't foolish for having let him take over. I had been doing what I'd learned to do in a family that rewarded deference and punished questions. I had been playing by the rules I'd been given. The problem wasn't that I followed those rules. The problem was that the rules were designed by someone who benefited from my following them. Recognizing that didn't make me angry. It made me extraordinarily free. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does in upstate New York, grudging and cold right up until suddenly it wasn't. My wrist healed. My ribs stopped aching. I started running again in the mornings, something I had given up during recovery and had missed more than I'd admitted. I threw myself back into my work with an energy I hadn't had in years. I'm a freelance graphic designer. I've done brand identity work mostly, logos and visual systems for small businesses, and I had been coasting for a while before my grandmother died, going through the motions of a career without a real sense of direction. After everything, I started approaching my work differently. I started being more honest in client conversations about what I thought would actually serve them, even when it wasn't what they were asking for. I started turning down projects that didn't interest me, which sounds like a small thing but felt enormous. A client I'd worked with twice before referred her sister to me, and her sister referred someone else, and by May I had more work than I could handle, and had started thinking seriously about whether I wanted to bring someone on to help. The idea of building something real, something that was actually mine in the clearest possible sense, not a half measure, not a deferred dream, felt like something that had been waiting for exactly this version of me to arrive. I didn't speak to my brother for 8 months. He sent a single email after the legal settlement, 3 sentences that acknowledged nothing and apologized for nothing and contained the phrase, "I hope we can move past this for the sake of the family," which is the kind of sentence that takes more from you than it gives. I read it twice, wrote a response in my head that I didn't send, and let it sit unanswered. There are things people say about family that are meant to sound like wisdom but function more like a leash. That blood is thicker than water. That family is forever. That whatever happens between you, they're still your family. These things are said by people who have mostly been treated well by their families, or by people who were not treated well and have decided that endurance is the same thing as virtue. Sometimes it is, but sometimes the kindest and most honest thing you can do, for yourself and for the other person, is to stop pretending that a relationship is something other than what it actually is. My brother and I are not close. We share a grandmother I loved and a family history I am still sorting through and approximately nothing else. That's the truth of it. I don't say it with bitterness. I say it with the same clarity I felt sitting at my kitchen table in October with a letter in my hands and my whole life rearranging itself around a fact I couldn't unknow. Last month, Ruth and I had dinner with Patricia Huang and her husband at a Vietnamese restaurant downtown. We ate too much pho and stayed until the staff started stacking chairs, and Ruth told a story about a student she had 20 years ago who became a federal judge, and Patricia told a story about a case that went so sideways she still couldn't believe how it ended, and I listened to both of them and felt something I can only describe as full. Not happy exactly, though I was happy. Full. Like the specific satisfaction of a room that has been cleared of everything that wasn't supposed to be in it, and furnished slowly and deliberately with things that actually belong. I kept one thing from my grandmother's house before it was sold. Not the furniture, not the dishes. The wooden box from her nightstand. The index cards are all still in it, her handwriting on some of them, clipped magazine print on others, 1 or 2 in handwriting I don't recognize that must belong to people who mattered to her before I was born. I haven't read all of them yet. I take one out every so often when I feel like I need it, and I always find something worth keeping. The one on top right now says, in my grandmother's deliberate, slanting cursive, "Knowing what you deserve and refusing to settle for less, that's not stubbornness. That's self-respect." If you're listening to this right now and something in it sounds familiar, the brother who managed things, the parent who dismissed you, the partner who made you feel like your observations were the problem, I want you to hear me say this clearly. You are not too sensitive. You are not difficult. You are not making it complicated. You are seeing something real, and the discomfort you feel when you trust that sight is not a character flaw. It is the beginning of something. The people who belong in your life will not require you to shrink to fit. They will not need you to apologize for existing at full volume. They will sit in the chair across from you and stay 3 hours without being asked, and bring you soup, and leave novels outside your door, and mean it when they say call me if you need anything. Your real people are out there. Some of them you haven't met yet. Some of them are already across the hall. You don't have to earn your place at your own table. Stop apologizing for the space you take up, and don't be afraid to show up with the paperwork.